I found hope, tell my heart I told you so. Like bait in the lion's cage and wait for my time to come. 'Cause I need this so much more than you have. Yeah.
Imagine you have just escaped from years of torture. You are driving through the darkness in a stolen car, your body is broken, your mind is damaged, and the entire world is looking for you. You finally have freedom, but freedom does not mean you are safe. Every police officer could recognize you, every stranger could be watching you, every dollar you need to start a new life could force you back into the criminal world you desperately want to escape. Now imagine that this is not the beginning of a story, it is the ending of one. That is what makes El Camino, a Breaking Bad movie, so interesting. When Breaking Bad ended in 2013, audiences were left with one huge question. What happened to Jesse Pinkman? Walter White was dead, his empire was finished. The neo Nazi compound had been destroyed. Jesse had escaped in the final moments, screaming and laughing as he drove away in towards El Camino. Then the screen went black. For years, fans imagined what might happen next. Some believed Jesse would disappear forever. Some imagined him being arrested. Others believed he would finally find peace somewhere far away from Albuquerque. But Vince Gilligan had another idea. He wanted to tell the story of what happened immediately after Jesse escaped, and the surprising thing is that El Camino was never really designed to recreate Breaking Bad. It was designed to finish Jesse's story. That difference is extremely important. Because if you watch El Camino expecting another Breaking Bad season, you may wonder why the movie feels quieter, slower, and more personal. But if you watch it as the final chapter of Jesse Pinkman's life, the movie becomes something much more emotional. It is not really about becoming a drug kingpin. It is not about building an empire. It is not even about revenge. It is about a broken young man trying to discover whether he still deserves a future. And that is where Aaron Paul gives one of the most important performances of his career. Jess Pinkman was originally not even supposed to become the character we eventually knew. When Breaking Bad began, Jesse was introduced as Walter White's former student and a small time criminal. He was supposed to be part of Walt's early journey into the drug business. But as the series developed, something unexpected happened. Jesse became the emotional heart of the entire story. Walter became more powerful, Jess became more human, Walter became increasingly comfortable with violence, Jess became increasingly horrified by it. Walter learned how to manipulate people. Jesse constantly struggled with guilt. And by the time Breaking Bad reached its final season, Jesse was no longer simply Walt's partner. He was the person who had suffered the consequences of Walt's decisions more than almost anyone else. That is why his escape at the end of Breaking Bad felt so powerful. For the first time in years, Jesse was free, but freedom was only the beginning. Vince Gilligan started thinking about Jesse's future while Breaking Bad was still being developed. According to the production history, the idea for the movie eventually came together after Gilligan had finished the series and later approached Aaron Paul about the possibility of continuing Jesse's story. The script was completed after that development period and production was kept remarkably secret, and that secrecy became one of the most impressive parts of the entire project. Think about how difficult it is to hide a Breaking Bad movie. This was not some unknown independent production. This was one of television's most recognizable franchises. Aaron Paul had to return, Vince Gilligan had to return, several famous Breaking Bad actors had to return, Albuquerque had to be used. The crew had to rebuild recognizable locations, and yet Netflix managed to keep the project secret for a surprisingly long time. For months, fans did not even know that the movie existed. There were rumors, there were reports, there was speculation. But there was no official confirmation. That secrecy was especially important because the entire movie depended on surprise. If audiences knew Jesse's complete journey before watching it, many of the film's emotional moments would lose their power. The production even used fake explanations to hide what was really being filmed. One of the most recognizable objects in Breaking Bad history was the RV. So, when people noticed an iconic Breaking Bad vehicle appearing around a filming location, the production team had to come up with explanations that would not immediately reveal the truth. The filmmakers even used the excuse that some material was being filmed for a Breaking Bad tour. It sounds almost ridiculous, but it worked. And that tells you how seriously Gilligan and his team treated the secrecy of El Camino. The movie was officially announced only after much of the work had already been completed. That meant audiences were not watching the production happen in real time. They were essentially waiting for a secret that had already been finished. That is very different from the way most major Hollywood movies are produced today. The story itself was also carefully designed around Jesse's emotional state. At the beginning of the film, Jesse is not a hero, he is not confident, he is not clever, he is not prepared, he is terrified. He has just escaped from a place where he was physically and psychologically tortured. The first thing he needs is simple: a place to hide, then money, then identification, then a way out, and finally a completely new identity. That structure makes the movie feel almost like a survival thriller. Jess is not trying to defeat an army, he is trying to disappear. That sounds simple, but in the Breaking Bad universe, disappearing is incredibly difficult. Everyone has a history. Every criminal has enemies, every dollar has a story, every connection creates another risk. And Jesse's biggest enemy is not necessarily the police, it is his own past. The movie constantly jumps between the present and the past. These flashbacks are not random. They show us things that happened during Jesse's captivity and before his escape. The flashbacks also allow familiar characters to return. This was one of the smartest structural decisions in the movie because Gilligan did not want to simply bring old characters back for cheap nostalgia. Each flashback has a purpose, each one tells us something about Jesse. Each one reminds us what he lost, and each one helps explain why he is so desperate to start over. One of the most important returning characters is Todd Alquist, and Todd might be one of the strangest villains in the Breaking Bad universe. He looks polite, he speaks calmly, he can smile, he can behave like a normal person, and then he can do something absolutely horrifying without showing almost any emotion. Jesse's relationship with Todd is therefore one of the darkest elements of the movie. Todd is dead in the present timeline, but Jesse still has to live with what Todd did to him. That is an important distinction. Killing Todd did not erase the trauma. Escaping the compound did not erase the memories. Driving away did not suddenly make Jesse normal again. And this is one reason El Camino feels different from Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad was often about consequences. El Camino is about trauma. The movie asks a question that the original series never had enough time to explore. What happens to a person after the nightmare is finally over? We usually think the story ends when the prisoner escapes, but in real life, that is when another story begins. Jesse's body is free, his mind is still trapped. Aaron Paul understood that. He returned to the character with the difficult job of playing someone who had changed enormously, while also making the audience believe he was still the same Jesse. That is not easy. Jess from the early seasons was loud, he was funny. He was impulsive, he used slang constantly, he could be immature. But the Jesse in El Camino has been through years of torture. The humor is still there in small pieces, but it has been buried beneath exhaustion. Aaron Paul's performance works because he does not need to explain every emotion. Sometimes Jesse just looks at something. Sometimes he pauses before answering. Sometimes he appears completely exhausted. Those moments communicate what dialogue cannot. And this was exactly the kind of performance critics noticed. The film received strong reviews overall, with particular praise directed toward Paul's performance and Gilligan's ability to return to the Breaking Bad world without simply copying the television series. Rotten Tomatoes ultimately recorded a 92% critic score, while Metacritic gave the film a generally favorable score of 72 out of 100. But there was another interesting challenge. Aaron Paul had aged since Breaking Bad ended, so had many of the actors. That creates an unusual problem for a sequel that takes place almost immediately after the original story. In reality, 6 years had passed. In Jesse's world, almost no time had passed. The filmmakers therefore had to make the characters look as though they belong to the exact point in the Breaking Bad timeline. Hair, makeup, costumes, lighting, camera angles, and visual effects all became important. Bryan Cranston, for example, had grown his hair out after Breaking Bad, so the makeup team used a bald cap and other techniques to recreate Walter White's appearance for his flashback scenes. Additional visual effects were used to complete the illusion. And that leads to one of the most emotional parts of El Camino. Walter White returns. But he does not return to take over the story. He returns because Jesse's story cannot be separated completely from Walt's. Whether Jesse likes it or not, Walter changed his life forever. Their relationship was complicated from the beginning. Walt was Jesse's teacher, then his partner, then his manipulator, then in many ways his destroyer. But their relationship was never completely simple. There were moments when Walt genuinely seemed to care about Jesse. There were also moments when Walt's actions caused Jesse enormous suffering. El Camino does not try to rewrite that relationship. Instead, it gives us another look at it. The flashback involving Walt and Jesse works because it reminds us of something that Breaking Bad gradually made easy to forget. At one point, these two men were simply sitting together talking about what might happen next. Before everything became murder, betrayal, money, and destruction, there were still moments where Jesse was just a young man trying to figure out his life. That is the Jesse El Camino wants us to remember. Not just the criminal, not just the meth cook. Not just Walter White's partner, a human being. Another returning character who became extremely important was Ed Galbraith, played by Robert Forster. Ed was the mysterious vacuum repairman who secretly helped criminals disappear. In Breaking Bad, his service represented something almost magical. You paid him enough money, he gave you a new identity, and suddenly your old life disappeared. For Jesse, Ed represents the final door to freedom. But there is a problem: freedom costs money. And Jesse does not have enough. That creates the central engine of the movie. He needs money fast and he needs it without getting caught. The filmmakers also had to recreate Ed's vacuum repair shop. The original location had changed after Breaking Bad ended, so production rebuilt the environment and searched for matching props. It is an incredible example of how much detail went into making El Camino feel like a genuine continuation rather than a completely new movie wearing a Breaking Bad costume. Robert Forster's involvement is particularly emotional because he died on the day El Camino was released. That gave his appearance an unexpected significance. The movie became one of his final screen performances. And suddenly, a character who was already associated with disappearing and leaving the past behind became part of a film that was itself saying goodbye to an era. That is one of those strange moments where real life becomes more emotional than fiction. The production of El Camino was also unusual because Vince Gilligan had much more time than he normally had while making Breaking Bad. Television production moves quickly. A director cannot always spend an entire day searching for the perfect camera angle. Episodes have deadlines, scenes have to be completed, the crew has to move. El Camino had a different rhythm. The film reportedly shot only around 1.5 to 3 script pages per day, compared with the much faster pace Gilligan and his crew had experienced during Breaking Bad. That slower pace gave everyone more time, more takes, more camera setups, more room for improvisation, and perhaps most importantly, more time to think about the movie as a complete piece of cinema. Gilligan later described the slower process as giving him a greater feeling of finality. That makes sense. Breaking Bad had been a huge television machine. El Camino was personal. Gilligan knew that this might be his last opportunity to tell Jesse's story. So instead of rushing toward the ending, the production allowed scenes to breathe. That is visible throughout the film. Look at the opening. Look at the long stretches where Jesse is simply moving through spaces. Look at the quiet moments. Look at the way the camera stays with him. This is not a movie that needs explosions every 5 minutes. The tension comes from uncertainty. Will Jesse be recognized? Will someone betray him? Will he find the money? Can he trust anyone? Will he actually get away? And then there is the visual style. Breaking Bad already had an unforgettable visual language. Wide desert landscapes, extreme close ups, unusual camera positions, strong compositions, objects filmed from strange angles. El Camino keeps many of those traditions but expands them into something more cinematic. That was important because Gilligan had always wanted the Breaking Bad world to work on a big screen. The film gave him the opportunity to use larger compositions and wider landscapes. One of the most beautiful examples is the painted desert sequence. Gilligan had become interested in the landscape after seeing it during helicopter trips between California and Albuquerque. The production eventually received permission to film in the area. The result is one of the movie's most visually striking sections. The desert does not simply look beautiful, it makes the characters look small. That is important. Jess is running from an enormous past. The landscape visually represents how insignificant one person can feel when surrounded by something so huge. Gilligan reportedly considered the painted desert shoot one of the best directing days of his career. And there is a fascinating behind the scenes story connected to it. Gilligan himself was a licensed pilot and flew Aaron Paul and Jesse Plemons to the location by helicopter. Imagine that you are directing a Breaking Bad movie. You are flying your actors over the desert. You land. Then you start shooting scenes involving two of the darkest characters in the entire story. It sounds like something that should be part of a movie itself. The Todd sequence also contains one of the strangest moments in the film. Todd sings along to Sharing the Night Together while driving. The scene is uncomfortable because Todd is behaving like an ordinary person. He looks happy, he is singing. He is relaxed, but the audience knows exactly who Todd is. That contrast makes the scene disturbing. Jess is sitting beside him. Jess knows what Todd is capable of. The audience knows what Todd is capable of. And yet, Todd is behaving as though they are simply two normal friends going for a drive. That is classic Breaking Bad storytelling. The horror often becomes more disturbing when it is presented as ordinary. Todd does not need to scream. He does not need to threaten Jesse, his normal behavior is enough. Another major technical decision involved sound. Gilligan wanted natural sounds to feel authentic. Wireless microphones were placed around sets and actors so the production could capture natural dialogue and ambient sound. The filmmakers wanted to avoid relying too heavily on replacement dialogue in post production. That may sound like a small technical detail, but sound is extremely important in El Camino. The movie has long, quiet sections. When the soundtrack becomes quiet, small sounds suddenly matter: a car engine, a door, footsteps, a breath, a distant noise. The sound of a weapon, the sound of Jesse moving through a room, all of these create tension. And then there is the music. For Breaking Bad fans, the name Dave Porter immediately means something. Porter composed the music for Breaking Bad and later worked on Better Call Saul. Bringing him back for El Camino was almost essential, but Porter faced a difficult challenge. How do you make the movie sound like Breaking Bad without simply copying Breaking Bad? The answer was to begin with familiar musical language and gradually create something more personal for Jesse. Porter had far more time to work on the movie than he normally had on a television episode. He spent roughly 6 to 8 weeks developing the score compared with the much shorter scoring schedules common for television episodes. Gilligan was also able to spend more time directly listening to the music and discussing it with Porter. That extra time mattered. The score does not simply tell us that something dangerous is happening, it often tells us what Jesse is feeling: fear. Confusion, desperation, hope, regret, determination. Porter also made an important decision. He did not want to simply use the famous Breaking Bad theme as the musical identity of Jesse's movie. The original theme was closely associated with Walter White's journey. El Camino needed something different. It needed to feel like Jesse. That is why the music gradually develops its own identity. Porter described the movie as an opportunity to focus much more intensely on one character because Breaking Bad had so many storylines happening at once. El Camino had one central emotional journey, Jesse's. And that might be the biggest difference between the movie and the series. Breaking Bad was an epic story. El Camino is a personal story. Breaking Bad asks how far Walter White will go. El Camino asks how far Jesse Pinkman has to go to become Jesse again. That is a much smaller question, but emotionally it can be just as powerful. The film's title is also more meaningful than it first appears. El Camino refers to the Chevrolet El Camino that Jesse drives away in after escaping the compound. But the title also works symbolically. Jess is literally traveling. He is also searching for a path, a way forward, a road away from Walter White. A road away from Todd, a road away from the meth business, a road away from the person he became. In Spanish, El Camino means the road or the way. And Jesse's entire movie is about finding a way. There is also a clever Western influence throughout the film. Breaking Bad always had elements of a modern Western. Albuquerque, the desert. Criminals, outlaw showdowns, lonely roads, men carrying guns into open spaces. El Camino takes that idea and pushes it further. The final confrontation at the welding facility is practically a modern Western duel. Two men, a tense location, a gun, a countdown, silence waiting, the music becomes sparse. The scene is not designed like a traditional action movie, it is designed like a showdown. Dave Porter specifically described the welding facility confrontation as the clearest Western style moment in the movie and aimed for a modern musical interpretation of that classic tension. And Jesse's final journey makes that Western imagery even stronger. He is the outlaw trying to leave the frontier behind. But unlike many classic Western heroes, Jesse does not want fame, he does not want revenge, he does not want power. He wants anonymity, he wants a quiet life, he wants to become someone nobody has heard of. That is almost the opposite of Walter White. Walter wanted to become unforgettable, Jess wants to disappear. And that contrast is one of the deepest ideas in the movie. Walter wanted people to know his name, Jess wants nobody to know his name. Walter built an empire, Jess wants a small future, Walter became Heisenberg. Jesse wants to stop being Pinkman the criminal, he simply wants to live. That is why the ending works. It is not a huge victory, there is no giant celebration, there is no parade, there is no announcement. Jesse simply drives toward the possibility of a new life, and that is exactly what he needed, not a perfect ending. Just a chance. The final scenes also connect emotionally with the entire Breaking Bad story. For years, Jesse was constantly running. Running from the police, running from dealers, running from Walt, running from himself. In El Camino, he is still running, but this time he is running towards something. That is a huge difference. His escape is no longer just about getting away. It is about arriving somewhere, and that is why the final image has so much emotional weight. The road ahead is uncertain, but for the first time, the uncertainty belongs to Jesse. Not Walt, not Gus, not Todd, not the Nazis, not the DEAs. His life is finally his own, and perhaps that is the real ending of Breaking Bad. Not Walter White dying, not the meth empire collapsing, not Jesse escaping the compound. The real ending is Jesse finally becoming free. Of course, not everyone thought El Camino was necessary. And this is where the movie becomes interesting to discuss. Breaking Bad already had one of the most praised endings in television history. So why make another ending? Some viewers believed Jesse's escape in the finale was already perfect. They felt that his future should remain unknown. They argued that mystery was part of the beauty. If Jesse disappeared into the distance, audiences could imagine whatever life they wanted for him. El Camino removes some of that mystery. It tells us what happened. For some fans, that was exactly what they wanted. For others, it felt unnecessary. And both opinions are understandable. If Breaking Bad was a masterpiece with a perfect final scene, adding another chapter is risky. You could damage the legacy, you could make the ending feel smaller, you could turn a powerful mystery into an ordinary epilogue. But Vince Gilligan made a smart choice. He did not try to create another giant story, he made the movie intimate. That kept El Camino from competing directly with Breaking Bad. It is not bigger than the series, it is smaller, and that is why it works. The movie is almost like an emotional after credit scene that lasts more than 2 hours. It answers the question, what happened to Jesse? But it does not try to answer every question in the Breaking Bad universe. There is no attempt to explain everyone's future. There is no massive new drug empire. There is no artificial attempt to create another villain bigger than Gus Fring. There is no attempt to make Jesse become the next Walter White. Instead, Jesse's story ends quietly. That restraint deserves credit. The supporting cast also adds enormous value. Jess Plemons returns as Todd, and his performance remains one of the strangest parts of the movie. Kristen Ritter returns as Jane Margolis. Jonathan Banks returns as Mike Emantrout, Charles Baker returns as Skinny Pete, Matt Jones returns as Badger, and Bryan Cranston returns as Walter White. The returning actors are not all there for the same reason. Some exist to continue unfinished emotional relationships, some represent Jesse's past, some provide comedy, some represent the criminal world, and some remind us of how much Jesse has lost. Skinny Pete and Badger are particularly important because they provide something Jesse desperately needs: normal human connection. They are not perfect people. They are criminals, they have made mistakes, but they care about Jesse. Their scenes bring a little warmth into a movie filled with darkness. Skinny Pete's attitude toward Jesse is especially meaningful. He does not judge him. He does not demand an explanation, he simply helps. After everything Jesse has experienced, that kind of friendship matters, and it is one of the reasons the movie does not become completely depressing. There are still small pieces of the old Jesse. There are still people who care about him, there is still humor, there is still hope. That balance is important because without hope, El Camino would just be a 2 hour story about trauma. Instead, it becomes a story about recovery. Not complete recovery, not magical recovery, but the first step is enough, and perhaps that is why audiences connected with it. Netflix reported that more than 25 million households watched El Camino within its first week, while Nielsen estimated 2.65 million viewers watched it within its first day and 6.54 million during its opening weekend. Those numbers are particularly interesting because the movie was released primarily through streaming. There was no traditional massive theatrical campaign. Netflix gave it a limited theatrical run at the same time. The movie played in a limited number of cinemas before and around its streaming release. Because Netflix did not have a conventional wide theatrical release, its box office numbers were tiny compared with normal Hollywood movies. Only a portion of the theaters reported their grosses, with 12 of the 125 reporting theaters producing a combined $40,000 in the available figures. But judging El Camino by theatrical box office would be misleading. Its real box office was essentially the living rooms of millions of Netflix subscribers. That was the experiment. Could a television sequel feel like a movie? Could a streaming film satisfy fans of one of television's greatest dramas? The answer from critics was largely yes, but there was still a debate: was it necessary? That question followed El Camino everywhere. Some fans loved it because they wanted closure. Others felt that Jesse's original ending was already complete, and honestly, the disagreement is part of what makes the film worth discussing. A perfect sequel does not always need to be bigger. Sometimes it simply needs to be honest. El Camino is honest about what Jesse would realistically feel after Breaking Bad. He would not immediately become happy. He would not suddenly become rich. He would not forget everything. He would be damaged. He would be paranoid. He would be desperate. He would have nightmares. He would have to make difficult decisions. And he would probably never completely escape the person he had been. That is what makes the movie feel human. Jesse's biggest victory is not getting money, it is believing that he can still have a future. And that is a much more powerful ending than another criminal shootout. There are also dozens of small details hidden throughout the movie that make it rewarding for longtime Breaking Bad fans. The filmmakers reused locations, they recreated props, they brought back familiar characters, they used flashbacks to connect events. They recreated costumes and appearances, they referenced earlier scenes, they used music that reminded audiences of the original series. But these references generally serve the story. They are not just Easter eggs. That distinction matters. A bad sequel says, remember this. A good sequel says, remember what this meant. El Camino usually tries to do the second. When we see certain characters again, we remember what they meant to Jesse. When we see certain locations, we remember what happened there. When we hear familiar musical ideas, we remember how far Jesse has traveled. The movie is essentially built from memories, and Jesse is the person carrying all those memories. That is why the film feels almost like a psychological road movie. He is physically traveling through Albuquerque and beyond, but emotionally, he is traveling through his own past. Every stop brings another memory, every person reminds him of something. Every dollar connects him to the criminal world, every attempt to escape forces him to confront the person he used to be, and by the end, he finally makes one last choice. He chooses himself. That may sound simple, but for Jesse Pinkman, it is enormous. Because for most of Breaking Bad, Jesse's life was controlled by other people. Walter controlled him, Gus controlled him, the cartel controlled him, the Nazis controlled him, Todd controlled him, even his addiction controlled him. For the first time, Jesse is making a decision without someone else forcing him. That is freedom, not the absence of consequences, not the absence of pain. Freedom means choosing what happens next, and that is where El Camino ultimately finds its meaning. It is not really a story about escaping the Breaking Bad universe. It is a story about escaping the identity that universe forced onto Jesse. The young man who once shouted, "Yeah, science," is now trying to figure out what life looks like after science. Money, drugs, violence, and Walter White, he does not know, neither do we. But for once, that uncertainty feels positive because Jesse has finally reached a road where nobody else knows where he is going. And maybe that is exactly the ending he deserved. The most fascinating thing about El Camino is that Vince Gilligan did not begin with the question, how can we make another Breaking Bad? He began with a much smaller and more personal question, what happened to Jesse Pinkman? That difference shaped almost everything about the movie. Gilligan had already given Breaking Bad an ending that many people considered nearly perfect, so creating a sequel was dangerous. If the film tried to become bigger than the series, it could easily feel unnecessary. Instead, Gilligan made the story smaller. He moved away from the rise and fall of Walter White and focused almost entirely on one damaged young man trying to survive the consequences of everything that had happened to him. Netflix's own description of the film essentially frames it the same way. Jesse must confront his past before he can build any kind of future. That idea also explains why El Camino feels different from Breaking Bad. The television series was about transformation. Walter White started as a chemistry teacher and slowly became Heisenberg. Every season pushed him deeper into a world where money, pride, fear, and power changed him. Jesse's story moved in almost the opposite direction. Jesse began as a reckless young criminal, but the more terrible things he experienced, the more he became aware of the human cost of that world. By the end of the series, Jesse was probably the character who wanted to escape that life more than anyone. He had seen people die, he had been manipulated, he had been beaten, he had been imprisoned, he had been forced to cook meth, he had lost people he loved, and then in the final episode, Walter finally gave him a chance to escape. That escape was unforgettable, but Gilligan apparently felt there was still another emotional chapter hiding inside it. The idea had been developing as far back as the writing of the Breaking Bad finale, and Gilligan eventually approached Aaron Paul about the possibility of continuing Jesse's story in a movie. Aaron Paul's return was obviously the most important part of the entire project. Without him, there could be no El Camino. But his return also created one of the biggest challenges. Jesse Pinkman was supposed to be almost exactly the same age as he had been at the end of Breaking Bad, while Aaron Paul was several years older by the time production began. The audience was being asked to believe that the movie takes place almost immediately after Jesse escapes, even though the real world had moved forward by years. This is one of those situations where filmmaking becomes a strange form of illusion. Hair, makeup, wardrobe, lighting, camera angles, and visual effects all had to work together. The filmmakers were not simply trying to make Aaron Paul look younger, they were trying to make us forget that time had passed at all. And because the Breaking Bad audience knows Jesse's face so well, even a small mistake could have broken the illusion. The casting decisions were also clever because the returning characters were not all treated equally. Jesse Plemons came back as Todd, Kristen Ritter returned as Jane, Jonathan Banks returned as Mike, Charles Baker and Matt Jones returned as Skinny Pete and Badger, Robert Forster returned as Ed, and Bryan Cranston returned as Walter White. The official production history confirms that several major Breaking Bad performers reprised their roles. But the important thing is that these characters represent different parts of Jesse's life. Jane represents love and possibility. Mike represents a strange kind of mentorship. Todd represents trauma and imprisonment. Ed represents escape. Skinny Pete and Badger represent friendship. Walter represents almost everything complicated about Jesse's past. So when these characters appear, they are not simply cameos. Each one carries emotional baggage. Todd is especially interesting because Jesse Plemons plays him in a way that almost makes the character more disturbing than a traditional villain. Todd does not look like a movie monster. He does not constantly shout or threaten people. He can smile politely. He can have normal conversations. He can even sing along to music in the car. And that normal behavior makes him frightening because the audience already knows what he is capable of. One of the film's strangest sequences has Todd singing along to Sharing the Night Together while driving with Jesse. On paper, it sounds almost funny. In the context of the story, it is deeply uncomfortable. Jesse is sitting beside a person who has done horrifying things, and Todd is behaving like they are simply taking a normal road trip. It is the kind of dark irony that Breaking Bad became famous for. Todd's apartment is another brilliant example of this idea. The place tells us something about Todd without needing a long speech. It looks ordinary, even cozy in certain ways. There are personal belongings, decorations, and evidence of a normal life. But Jesse knows that behind the ordinary appearance is a deeply disturbed person. This creates a strange contradiction. Todd wants to appear normal while Jesse knows the truth. That contrast is one reason Todd remains so memorable. He does not need to be constantly violent to be scary. His calmness is the scary part, and then there is Walter White. Bringing Bryan Cranston back could have been one of the easiest ways for the movie to become nothing more than fan service. Imagine if Walter suddenly appeared in the present, alive and somehow involved in Jesse's new life. It would have destroyed the ending of Breaking Bad. Gilligan wisely avoids that. Walter appears through a flashback, which allows the character to exist without changing the reality of the series finale. It also gives the audience one more look at the strange relationship between these two men. Walter and Jesse were never simply friends or enemies. They were partners, teacher and student, almost family at certain moments, and destructive forces in each other's lives at others. Their flashback is important because it shows Jesse before the final collapse. Walter can still talk to him almost like a teacher. Jesse can still joke with him, they can still sit together and discuss the future, but the audience knows something they do not. We know where their relationship eventually leads. That knowledge makes the scene sad. We are looking at a version of their relationship that can never exist again. It is almost like seeing a photograph of someone after you already know how their life ends. One of the most interesting things about El Camino is how much it relies on memory. The present day Jesse is constantly surrounded by the past. He cannot simply leave Albuquerque and forget everything. The film keeps taking us backward through flashbacks, showing pieces of what happened before and during his captivity. These flashbacks are not only there to bring back popular characters, they help explain Jesse's psychological condition. The movie wants us to understand that escaping physically is only half the battle. Jesse has to escape mentally as well. That is why the film's structure can feel unusual. We know Jesse escaped because we watched him do it in Breaking Bad. The question is not whether he will survive the escape, we already know he does. The question is whether he can actually build a new life that removes some traditional suspense but replaces it with emotional suspense. We are not asking, will Jesse get out of the building? We are asking, will Jesse ever feel free? Those are completely different questions, and Aaron Paul carries that emotional weight almost entirely through his performance. Jesse does not talk as much as he did during the series. He does not have the same energy. The old Jesse could be loud and funny and unpredictable. He could yell at Walt, make jokes, complain, swear, and get himself into trouble. The Jesse we see in El Camino has been through something that has changed him. His silence becomes part of the performance. Sometimes his face says more than dialogue could. That is one reason critics responded so strongly to Paul's performance. Rotten Tomatoes currently lists the movie at 92% from critics, with its consensus specifically praising the film as a satisfying continuation and highlighting Aaron Paul's performance. Other reviews similarly focused on the difficulty of Paul's job. He had to play Jesse across different periods of his life, including the younger Jesse audiences remembered and the traumatized Jesse who appears after the finale. There's an argument that Aaron Paul was almost trapped by the success of Jesse Pinkman. The character became so recognizable that audiences could easily expect the old version of him. They wanted the jokes. They wanted, yeah, bitch. They wanted the familiar Jesse. But El Camino understands that bringing back exactly the same Jesse would make no sense. The entire point is that Jesse has changed. The character's silence is therefore not a weakness in the movie. It is evidence of what happened to him. Vince Gilligan also made a very interesting decision with the action. He could have made the film much more violent. Breaking Bad had huge shootouts, explosions, and brutal deaths. Instead, El Camino uses violence more carefully. When Jesse does fight, it feels personal. When he is threatened, the danger feels immediate because he has almost nothing left. He is not an unstoppable action hero. He is a frightened man improvising his way toward freedom. The welding shop confrontation is a perfect example. The sequence feels almost like an old western. Jesse walks into a dangerous situation where he knows exactly what kind of people he is dealing with. The environment is open, industrial, and intimidating. The tension comes from waiting. Who will move first? Who has the advantage? Can Jesse survive? The scene is not simply about shooting, it is about Jesse finally taking control of a situation instead of being controlled by someone else. That Western feeling was intentional in the movie's visual and musical language. Breaking Bad always had a modern Western quality, but El Camino pushes it further. Jesse becomes an outlaw who does not want to become famous. He does not want to control territory. He does not want to become another drug kingpin. He wants to disappear. He is almost the reverse of Walter White. Walter spent years trying to make his name mean something. Jesse wants his name to mean nothing to anyone. That contrast is one of the strongest themes in the entire movie. Walter wanted recognition. Jesse wants anonymity. Walter wanted power. Jesse wants peace. Walter built an empire. Jesse wants a small room, a new identity, and a chance to wake up without looking over his shoulder. Walter became Heisenberg because he wanted to prove something. Jesse's final journey is about letting go of the need to prove anything. This also explains the importance of Ed Galbraith. Ed, the vacuum repairman who secretly relocates criminals, was one of the most mysterious characters in Breaking Bad. His business was almost like a supernatural service. You paid him, and your old life disappeared. For Jesse, Ed represents the possibility of becoming somebody else. But the service costs money and Jesse does not have enough. So the movie gives Jesse a final problem that feels completely appropriate. If he wants freedom, he has to earn the price of it. Robert Foster's return as Ed became even more emotional because the actor died on the same day El Camino was released. That made his performance one of the final screen appearances of a beloved actor, and it gave the film's farewell quality an unexpected real world sadness. The character already represents disappearing from one life into another, and Foster's death on release day gave that idea an almost haunting quality for fans watching the film. Foster's performance is also a great example of why El Camino does not need huge speeches to create emotion. Ed is not sentimental, he is practical. He looks at Jesse's situation and sees a problem that needs to be solved. But beneath his professional attitude, there is an interesting relationship between the two characters. Ed does not rescue Jesse simply because he likes him. Jesse has to convince him. He has to show that he is serious. He has to understand that starting a new life requires accepting responsibility for the past. That is another theme running through the film. Jesse cannot simply wish his old life away. He has to pay for his mistakes. Not necessarily in the legal sense, because he is trying to escape the police, but emotionally. He has to confront what happened. He has to remember the people he lost. He has to deal with the violence he participated in. He has to decide what kind of person he wants to be. This is where the movie becomes much more than a crime thriller. It becomes a story about identity. Who is Jesse Pinkman without Walter White? Who is he without meth? Who is he without the Albuquerque criminal world? Who is he without the people who constantly told him what to do? Those questions are never presented like a philosophy lecture. They are built into the plot. Every time Jesse makes a choice, we are watching him slowly separate himself from his old identity. The movie's title becomes even more meaningful because El Camino is literally connected to the road, but Jesse is also searching for his own path. He has spent years following other people. He followed Walt, he followed dealers, he followed criminals, he was forced to follow the Nazis. Now, for perhaps the first time, he is choosing the direction himself. And that is why the final moments are so important. Some viewers expected something bigger. They wanted a huge final scene, a massive confrontation, or a dramatic announcement about Jesse's future. Gilligan instead gives us something quieter. Jesse drives toward Alaska and toward a new identity. We do not see every detail of his future. We do not know exactly what kind of life he will build. We simply know that he has a chance that was probably the smartest possible choice. Because the movie's goal was never to tell us that Jesse would suddenly be happy, it was to tell us that happiness was possible. There is a huge difference. Jesse has suffered too much for the ending to pretend everything is fine. He cannot erase what happened. He cannot bring Jane back. He cannot undo what happened to Andrea. He cannot forget the compound. He cannot undo his relationship with Walt. Those things will always be part of him. But they do not have to control the rest of his life. That is what freedom means for Jesse, not forgetting. Choosing what comes next. The production itself was almost as secretive as Jesse's escape. The movie was filmed in New Mexico under a fake title, Greenbrier, and principal photography began in secret in November 2018. The production lasted close to 50 days. The project remained officially unconfirmed until Netflix released its trailer in August 2019. Think about how difficult that was. Today, major productions are photographed constantly. A fan can see an actor walking around a set and immediately post the picture online. A drone can capture filming locations, a crew member can accidentally reveal something. A production notice can appear on the internet. Social media can turn a secret into worldwide news within minutes. Yet El Camino managed to remain almost completely hidden. The secrecy was so intense that people involved in the production had to be extremely careful about what they said publicly. The fake title helped. The fact that many people were not told the full truth also helped. Even the production's locations and activities were carefully controlled. Reports from the time described the project as being under heavy lock and key, and this secrecy made the first trailer incredibly powerful. Imagine being a Breaking Bad fan in 2019 and suddenly seeing Jesse Pinkman again, not in an interview, not in a reunion, not in a joke, just Pinkman, the same character, the same world, the same Albuquerque atmosphere. And then realizing that a whole movie had secretly been made, that was a marketing dream. Instead of spending years promoting the movie, Netflix essentially allowed mystery to become part of the advertising campaign. The question was everywhere. What happened to Jesse? That question had existed for 6 years. Then suddenly there was an answer. The film was released on Netflix on October 11, 2019, at the same time as its limited theatrical release. It later received a television premiere on AMC. This release strategy was another interesting part of the movie's history because El Camino was treated as both a streaming event and a cinematic experience, and audiences showed up. Netflix announced that more than 25 million households watched the film during its first 7 days. Nielsen estimated an average minute audience of about 6.5 million during its first 3 days, with nearly 8. 2 million television viewers reached in that period. Under its measurement system, the box office story is more complicated. Because the movie was not released worldwide in the traditional theatrical way, its theatrical gross was tiny compared with a normal Hollywood film. A limited number of theaters screened it and only a portion reported grosses. But comparing that number directly with a traditional movie's box office is not really fair. The primary destination was Netflix, where millions of people watched from home. In other words, El Camino was not designed to win a weekend box office competition. Its real competition was expectation. Could it live up to Breaking Bad? That was the challenge, and this is where the critical reaction becomes interesting. Critics generally liked the movie, but many also described it as unnecessary. Rotten Tomatoes consensus itself uses that idea. The film is entertaining and satisfying, but not essential. That single word, essential, perfectly describes the debate surrounding the movie. Because did we need El Camino? No. Did Jesse's story benefit from it? For many fans, absolutely. There is a difference between a movie being necessary and a movie being worthwhile. El Camino was not necessary to understand Breaking Bad. You can watch the series finale, see Jesse escape, and stop there. The story still works. But El Camino gives Jesse something the finale could not fully give him. Time to breathe, time to be scared, time to think, time to remember, time to make one final choice. And perhaps that is why fans who love the movie tend to describe it as closure rather than a traditional sequel. It is not trying to open a new chapter of the Breaking Bad universe, it is closing an old one. The movie also became a kind of tribute to the entire Breaking Bad era. By bringing back actors, locations, music, and visual ideas, Gilligan created something that feels almost like visiting a place you have not seen in years. You recognize everything But you also realize that it has changed. That feeling is important because El Camino arrived 6 years after the series finale. For the fans, 6 years had passed. For Jesse, only hours had passed. The audience therefore experienced a strange emotional situation. We had grown older while Jesse was still standing at the same point in his life. That makes the movie feel almost like a reunion with someone you used to know. And perhaps that is why the film's fan service works better than it might have in another franchise. The returning characters are not simply there to make fans scream, they are memories. Jane is a memory, Mike is a memory, Walter is a memory. Todd is a nightmare, Skinny Pete and Badger are reminders that Jesse once had friends. Ed is the final door. Each appearance helps Jesse understand where he came from, and eventually he can leave. That is why the film's ending does not need another sequel. Jesse's story has reached the place it was always trying to reach. Not perfection, not happiness, not redemption in some grand Hollywood sense, just possibility. And if you think about where Jesse started, that is enormous. He began as a young man who was careless with his life. He ended as a man who desperately wanted to protect it. That is character development. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about El Camino is that Jesse does not need to become another Walter White to prove he has changed. He does not need money, he does not need power, he does not need revenge, he simply needs a future. One of the most interesting things to look at when discussing El Camino is the way Vince Gilligan approached the idea of closure. In Hollywood, closure is often treated as an excuse to bring characters back for another adventure. A successful character gets another problem, another villain appears, and the story continues because audiences want more. But Gilligan took a different approach. He understood that Jesse's story did not need another giant criminal conspiracy. It needed emotional resolution. That is why the movie feels almost like a missing chapter from the original series rather than a completely separate sequel. The story begins exactly where audiences remember Jesse, but instead of immediately jumping into a huge plot, it allows us to sit with him. We see the exhaustion in his face, we see him trying to understand what freedom actually means. We see him realizing that escaping Todd's compound did not magically repair the damage done to him. That decision gives the movie a much more mature tone than a simple sequel would have had. This is also why the opening sequence is so important. Jesse's escape in the final episode of Breaking Bad was one of the most energetic and emotional moments of the entire series. He drives away in Todd's El Camino, screaming and laughing, overwhelmed by the fact that he is finally free. If El Camino had simply started with Jesse celebrating his freedom, it would have felt strange. Instead, the movie immediately reminds us that he is still in danger. The police are looking for him. His name is connected to a massive criminal investigation. His face is recognizable. He has almost no money. He has no legal identity that can safely carry him into a normal future. Even worse, he has spent so long being controlled by other people that he barely knows how to make decisions for himself. The freedom we saw at the end of Breaking Bad was real, but it was fragile. The movie's first job is to show us just how fragile it is. The police investigation is another interesting element because Jesse is not trying to defeat the police, he is trying to avoid them. That changes the type of tension the movie creates. In many crime films, the police are simply an obstacle between the hero and the objective. Here, they represent the possibility that Jesse's entire escape could collapse. Every time he moves through Albuquerque, there is the possibility that somebody could recognize him. Every news report about the massacre reminds him that the world knows what happened, and Jesse cannot simply walk into a police station and explain everything. His story is too complicated. He was connected to Walter White. He was involved in the meth business. He was held captive by criminals. He was a victim and a participant at the same time. That moral complexity is one of the things that makes Jesse such an interesting character. The film also does something subtle with Jesse's appearance. Throughout Breaking Bad, Jesse's clothes and physical appearance often reflected where he was emotionally. The colorful clothing of his younger years matched his reckless personality. Later, as his life became darker, his appearance became more exhausted and ordinary. In El Camino, his clothing is almost functional. He is not trying to express himself through fashion, he is trying to survive. His face is often dirty or tired. His body language is defensive. He looks like somebody who has spent a long time expecting danger. That physical performance works alongside the costume design to communicate his trauma without requiring a constant explanation. And then we get to one of the most controversial details surrounding the film, the age difference. Some viewers noticed that Aaron Paul and other returning actors obviously looked older than they did in the original series. This became a popular joke among fans, especially when the movie placed them in flashbacks that were supposed to occur years earlier in the story. People online joked about Jesse somehow looking older immediately after escaping, and similar jokes appeared whenever returning characters showed up in flashbacks. It became one of those strange situations where the audience knows exactly what is happening behind the camera but chooses to enjoy the illusion anyway. The joke became part of the experience because everyone understood that the actors had actually aged while their characters had not. The interesting thing is that the age issue did not destroy the movie for most viewers. Why? Because Aaron Paul was so strongly associated with Jesse that the audience was willing to accept the illusion. Within minutes, many fans simply stopped thinking about the actor's real age and started thinking about Jesse again. That is a testament to how recognizable the character had become. When Paul starts speaking, moving, and reacting as Jesse, the years between the series and the film began to disappear. It is not perfect from a realistic perspective, but emotionally it works. The same thing happened with Bryan Cranston. Walter White's return could easily have become distracting, but because it is a flashback, the audience accepts it as a memory. The makeup and visual effects help recreate the earlier Walter, but the emotional reason for his appearance is even more important than his physical appearance. He is there to remind Jesse of a road that he does not want to travel again. Walter's presence is almost like the ghost of Jesse's old life. The movie does not need Walter to be alive because Walter already lives inside Jesse's memories. The relationship between Walter and Jesse remains one of the most fascinating relationships in modern television. They were never simply good or bad to each other. Walter saved Jesse's life at different points. Walter also destroyed parts of Jesse's life. Jesse helped Walter become powerful. Jesse also challenged Walter's morality. Walter often treated Jesse like a son when it was convenient, but he could also manipulate him in ways that a loving father never would. Jesse wanted approval from Walter even when he knew he should walk away from him. That contradiction made their relationship painful to watch, and El Camino uses it carefully. The flashback involving the two men talking about the future is especially interesting because Walter briefly gives Jesse advice about life outside the drug world. He talks about possibilities. He tries to encourage Jesse to think about what he could do with his life. There is something almost tragic about Walter giving that advice because Walter himself spent years refusing to follow it. He had opportunities to walk away. He chose power instead. Jesse, however, finally gets the opportunity to make the choice Walter could not make. That is perhaps the greatest contrast between the two characters. Walter had a chance to live a quiet life, but he believed he deserved something bigger. Jesse had a chance to live a quiet life, but the criminal world kept pulling him back. By the end, Jesse understands something Walter never fully accepted. A small life can still be a good life. You do not need millions of dollars. You do not need people to fear you. You do not need a legacy. Sometimes simply being alive and free is enough. This idea connects directly to the flashback involving Mike. Mike Ehrmantraut was one of the few people who gave Jesse advice without pretending that the criminal world was beautiful. Mike knew exactly what kind of life Jesse was involved in. He also knew that Jesse was capable of something better. Their relationship was not sentimental, but there was respect between them. Mike saw Jesse as someone who still had a conscience. Jesse's relationship with Mike was therefore very different from his relationship with Walter. Walter often wanted Jesse to become useful. Mike wanted Jesse to survive. The Mike flashback is one of the film's quietest and most meaningful scenes. The two men discuss Jesse's possible future, and Mike tells him that if he could do anything, he should go somewhere like Alaska. That idea becomes important later. It is not simply a random location, it becomes a symbol of escape. Alaska represents distance from Albuquerque, distance from the drug business, distance from Walter White, and distance from the identity Jesse has spent years carrying. There is also something beautiful about the fact that Mike never gets to see Jesse reach that destination. His advice survives him. Jesse carries it forward. In a strange way, Mike becomes one of the people helping Jesse escape even after Mike himself is gone. The character's influence continues through Jesse's decisions. That is a recurring idea throughout El Camino. The dead characters continue to influence the living. Jane influences Jesse, Mike influences Jesse, Walter influences Jesse, Andrea influences Jesse, even Todd influences Jesse, although in a much darker way. Jesse's final journey is therefore not just a physical trip. He is carrying all of these people with him. The difference is that by the end, he is finally deciding which parts of the past he wants to keep and which parts he needs to leave behind. Jane's return is especially emotional because she represents a version of Jesse's life that might have been possible. Before everything became even darker, Jesse and Jane had a relationship that felt different from the criminal world around them. They were young, they were imperfect, they had problems, but there was genuine affection. Their relationship also showed Jesse that someone could accept him without needing him to become Heisenberg's partner. Jane was not interested in Wall's empire. She cared about Jesse. The flashback with Jane therefore functions almost like a dream. Jesse remembers a time when the future still felt open. Jane talks about life as a river, a journey that cannot always be controlled. Her advice becomes part of the emotional foundation of the ending. Jesse has spent years trying to control things or survive other people's decisions. Eventually, he has to accept that he cannot change the past. He can only decide what to do next. That is a surprisingly mature message for a crime movie, and it also explains why the movie is not filled with constant references to Walter White. The story is about Jesse becoming his own person. Too much Walter would have turned the film into another chapter of Walt's story. Gilligan instead keeps Walter mostly in the past where he belongs. The present belongs to Jesse. Another character who represents Jesse's past is Skinny Pete. His role might seem small compared with Walter, Mike, or Todd, but emotionally it is enormous. Skinny Pete is one of the first people Jesse encounters after his escape, and his reaction tells us a lot. He does not treat Jesse like a monster. He does not immediately ask him for money. He does not try to take advantage of him. He simply wants to help his friend. The same is true of Badger. Their friendship may have started in a world of drugs and crime, but there is genuine loyalty between them. They are among the few people who knew Jesse before everything became complicated. Their willingness to help him provides one of the movie's rare moments of warmth. When Jesse is surrounded by fear, these two remind him that not every relationship in his life was destructive. Skinny Pete's role also became a source of fan appreciation and memes. His loyalty to Jesse became one of the most memorable examples of friendship in the Breaking Bad universe. Fans often joke that Skinny Pete is the real hero because, despite being involved in a criminal world, he repeatedly proves that he genuinely cares about Jesse. The joke works because there is truth underneath it. Skinny Pete does not have power. He does not have money. He is not a genius. But when Jesse needs help, he shows up. That is important because Breaking Bad is full of people who use each other. Walt uses Jesse, Gus uses Walt, dealers use addicts. Criminal organizations use everyone below them. Skinny Pete is different. He helps because Jesse is his friend. That makes his small role surprisingly meaningful. The movie also contains plenty of dark humor, and that humor is essential because without it, the story could become unbearably heavy. One of the best examples is the sequence involving the vacuum shop and the strange interactions Jesse has while trying to get enough money. Gilligan has always understood that comedy and tragedy can exist in the same scene. In Breaking Bad, a ridiculous moment could suddenly become horrifying. El Camino continues that tradition. The Todd storyline is another example. Todd's behavior can be so absurdly polite that it almost becomes dark comedy. He keeps talking calmly while doing terrible things. His attempts to behave like an ordinary person become increasingly strange because the audience knows the truth. Even his apartment and personal habits can feel bizarrely funny until you remember the context. One of the most talked about details was Todd's dead body situation. Jesse is forced to deal with the aftermath of Todd's actions, and the movie turns what could have been a simple criminal problem into something almost grotesquely absurd. The story repeatedly places Jesse in situations where he has to solve practical problems created by people who have completely lost their sense of morality. This is classic Breaking Bad humor. Something terrible happens, and then the characters have to deal with the bizarre logistics of it. The film's title also became a source of jokes because an El Camino is such a specific vehicle. For casual viewers, the title may sound like the name of a mysterious Spanish thriller. For Breaking Bad fans, it immediately identifies the car Jesse drove away in. That car became almost another character in the story. It represents escape, but it also represents evidence. Jesse is literally driving around in a vehicle connected to a massacre and a major criminal investigation. The thing that carried him to freedom is also something that can expose him. That contradiction is everywhere in the movie. The money Jesse needs comes from his criminal past. The people who can help him are connected to his criminal past. The identity he wants requires money earned through criminal methods. The vehicle he uses for escape comes from the criminal world. Even his memories of freedom are connected to people who hurt him. Jess cannot escape the past without passing through it. That is why the movie's structure works. Every problem forces him to confront another part of his old life. He cannot simply run north. He needs money first. He cannot simply get money legally. He needs to take risks. He cannot take those risks without confronting the people and places connected to his past. The welding shop sequence is therefore more than an action scene. It is Jesse's final test. He is no longer simply hiding. He is actively choosing to confront danger. The difference is that this time he has a reason. He is not fighting because Walt told him to. He is not cooking because somebody threatened him. He is not shooting because he wants revenge for someone else. He is fighting because he wants to live. That distinction changes the meaning of the violence. Jesse's final confrontation is not about becoming a killer, it is about surviving long enough to stop being one. The photography also helps communicate that transformation. Cinematographer Marshall Adams had to create images that felt connected to the visual language of Breaking Bad while still making the movie look cinematic. The film uses wide landscapes, controlled compositions, and dramatic lighting, but it also allows the camera to stay close to Jesse. The result is a mixture of Western imagery and intimate character drama. The desert is especially important. Albuquerque and the surrounding landscape were already major parts of Breaking Bad. In El Camino, the desert becomes almost symbolic. It is empty, enormous, and unforgiving. Jesse looks tiny against it. That visual contrast reminds us that he has lost almost everything. But the desert can also represent possibility because it has no obvious boundaries. There is room for him to disappear. The painted desert sequence is one of the clearest examples of the filmmakers using location to express emotion. Vince Gilligan reportedly became fascinated with the area while flying between locations and eventually wanted to film there. The production obtained permission and captured the landscape as part of Jesse's journey. The result looks almost dreamlike. Jesse is surrounded by a world that is enormous compared with him, yet for once the landscape does not feel like a prison. It feels like a road. That distinction is crucial throughout Breaking Bad. Wide open spaces often represented danger. The desert was where people were buried, it was where drug deals happened, it was where criminals disappeared. In El Camino, the same type of landscape can represent freedom. The location has not changed, Jess has. And that is one of the film's strongest visual ideas. Dave Porter's music also helps transform familiar locations into something new. Porter had already created the musical identity of Breaking Bad, but for El Camino he needed to score a story centered on Jesse. The score uses tension, atmosphere, and familiar musical colors without simply turning every scene into a nostalgic reference. Porter has explained that the movie allowed him much more time to work on the music than a typical television episode, giving him the opportunity to develop themes more carefully. Pop Disciple. The soundtrack also became important because the movie includes several carefully selected songs. Music in the Breaking Bad universe has always been more than background noise. Songs often create irony. A cheerful song can play during a disturbing moment. A sad song can turn an ordinary drive into an emotional memory. Todd singing along to music is a perfect example because his casual enjoyment clashes with the horror surrounding him. That contrast is very Breaking Bad. If you expect another Breaking Bad season finale, the pacing may frustrate you. If you approach it as a character study, it makes much more sense. The movie also benefits from being self contained. You can watch El Camino without immediately needing another sequel. It gives Jesse a destination and then stops. That is important because one of the biggest risks would have been creating another cliffhanger. Imagine the movie ending with Jesse reaching Alaska and then revealing another villain waiting for him. That would completely undermine the point. Instead, the story ends when Jesse has earned his chance. And perhaps the best thing about the final moments is that they do not promise perfection. We do not know if Jesse will be happy. We do not know if he will have nightmares. We do not know if he will ever trust people completely again. We do not know whether he will find love. We do not know whether he will become a successful carpenter. We do not know whether he will remain haunted by Albuquerque. We simply know that he has escaped. That is enough. For a character who spent years being told what he could and could not do, uncertainty finally becomes a gift. Jesse's future is unknown because nobody else controls it, and that is the most beautiful kind of freedom the character could receive. There is another layer to El Camino that becomes more interesting when you compare Jesse's journey with Walter White's. On the surface, both men are criminals who became deeply involved in the drug business, but their motivations and destinations were completely different. Walter kept telling himself that he was doing everything for his family, but as the years passed, it became increasingly clear that his pride and desire for control were driving him. Jesse, on the other hand, started in the drug world because he was young, reckless, and already involved in it. But he slowly developed a conscience that made it harder and harder for him to live with what he was doing. The tragedy is that the more Jesse tried to escape that world, the more people around him pulled him back into it. By the time El Camino begins, he has reached the absolute bottom. There is no empire left, no money waiting for him, no girlfriend waiting for him, and no powerful friend who can protect him. He has only himself. That is exactly why the movie feels like the final examination of Jesse Pinkman as a character. If Walter White's story was about a man discovering what he was capable of, Jesse's story is about a man discovering what he does not want to become. That is a very important difference. Walter becomes increasingly comfortable with violence because he starts believing that he is good at it and that his intelligence gives him the right to control other people. Jesse never becomes comfortable with it. Even when he participates in terrible things, he often feels guilt afterward. He has a conscience that keeps fighting against the environment around him. That conscience is part of why his suffering becomes so painful to watch. Jesse does not simply experience violence, he remembers it, he carries it, he thinks about the people affected by his choices. He cannot separate himself emotionally from what happened. The movie makes that clear without turning Jesse into a perfect hero. That is important because Jesse has made mistakes. He sold drugs, he worked with Walter, he participated in dangerous activities, he hurt people, he was responsible for some terrible decisions. The film does not erase those facts. Instead, it asks whether a person who has done bad things can still choose to become better. That is a much more interesting question than simply asking whether Jesse is good or bad. The answer is complicated. Jesse is both a victim and someone who has caused harm. He is responsible for some things and was forced into others. He has guilt, but he also deserves a chance to live. The movie does not need to give us a simple answer because Jesse himself is not a simple character. This is also why the idea of redemption works differently for Jesse than it does for Walter. Walter spends much of his final episode trying to correct some of the damage he caused, but even his redemption is complicated. He admits that he did things because he liked the power and because he was good at it. Jesse never gets that kind of confession because his conflict is different. He is not trying to prove that he was secretly innocent. He is trying to prove that his past does not have to define the rest of his life. His redemption comes through choice. He chooses to leave. He chooses to stop participating. He chooses to start again. The character of Ed represents that possibility more than almost anyone else. Ed is not emotionally invested in Jesse's history. He does not care about Walter White's reputation or the details of Jesse's relationship with him. Ed's business is about disappearing. That makes him almost the perfect person for Jesse to meet at the end of his journey. He is offering Jesse something that the rest of the Breaking Bad universe cannot offer, a clean break. But Ed is not going to give it away for free. Jesse has to prove that he is serious and has to find the money. This makes the final escape feel earned rather than magically given to him. The money itself becomes a symbol. Throughout Breaking Bad, money was power. Walter constantly wanted more of it. He measured success in millions of dollars. He built an enormous operation around the idea of financial security. Jesse's relationship with money is completely different. For Jesse, money is simply the price of freedom. He does not want to become rich. He wants enough to disappear. That makes the same object mean completely different things to the two characters. Walter sees money as a measurement of his success. Jesse sees money as a ticket out. This is one of the reasons the movie's smaller scale works so well. There is no need for another giant drug operation because Jesse does not want one. His objective is simple: get enough money, get the new identity, and leave. But simple does not mean easy. Every step creates another danger. He has to think quickly. He has to manipulate people, he has to return to places connected to his past, he has to take risks, and every time he does that, we understand how much he wants this new life. One of the most memorable sequences involves Jesse returning to the apartment connected to Todd. This part of the movie shows how differently Jesse sees the same world now. During his captivity, Todd controlled the situation completely. Jesse was powerless. In the movie's present timeline, Jesse enters Todd's world looking for something that can help him escape. The apartment becomes a strange combination of crime scene, prison, and treasure hunt. Every object reminds Jesse of the person Todd was and what Todd did. The fact that Jesse is searching through Todd's possessions also creates a strange reversal of power. Todd is dead, but Jesse is still dealing with his presence. The sequence becomes even stranger because Todd himself appears in flashbacks as a surprisingly ordinary person. This is deliberate. Gilligan does not want Todd to become a cartoon villain. He wants us to understand that monsters do not always look like monsters. Todd can eat breakfast, talk politely, decorate his apartment, and listen to music while also committing horrific acts. That contradiction is one of the most disturbing ideas in the entire Breaking Bad universe. Jesse's reaction to Todd is therefore different from his reaction to someone like Walter. Walter manipulates Jesse, but Jesse understands Walter's ambition. Todd is harder to understand because his emotional responses seem disconnected from the seriousness of his actions. Todd can do something horrible and then continue his day as if nothing happened. That makes him terrifying in a different way. Jesse is trapped not only by physical force but by the unpredictability of someone who does not seem to feel normal guilt. The film also uses Todd's fascination with Jesse in an uncomfortable way. Todd clearly sees Jesse as someone he can control. At times, he almost treats him like a companion while simultaneously imprisoning him. This creates a twisted relationship in which Todd thinks he is being kind while Jesse experiences his behavior as another form of torture. Todd's ability to misunderstand his own cruelty is what makes the scenes so disturbing. Jess Plemons deserves a lot of credit for making Todd believable. The performance could easily have become exaggerated, especially after the character became so hated by fans. Instead, Plemons keeps Todd calm. His voice rarely becomes threatening, his face often remains neutral. That makes the violence more shocking because it arrives from someone who does not look emotionally overwhelmed by what he is doing. Plemons was also noticeably older during filming, which became one of the most common fan jokes surrounding the movie. Fans could see that the actor had obviously aged, even though Todd's scenes were supposed to take place before the end of Breaking Bad. The internet had plenty of fun with that contradiction. And El Camino generated plenty of memes because Breaking Bad itself had become one of the internet's favorite sources of reaction images. Jesse's face, Walter's expressions, Saul Goodman's speeches, and Mike's deadpan reactions had already become part of online culture. When the movie arrived, fans immediately began turning its scenes into memes. Aaron Paul's intense expressions became reaction material. Jesse looking terrified became a perfect image for moments when someone realizes they have made a terrible decision. Skinny Pete's loyalty became another fan favorite. Todd's awkward behavior also inspired jokes because of how strangely polite he could be while doing horrifying things. The memes are interesting because they reveal something about how audience interact with Breaking Bad. The series is extremely dark, but the internet often transforms serious characters into comedy. Jesse especially became a meme because his emotional reactions are so expressive. He can look confused, angry, terrified, disappointed, and exhausted within seconds. That makes him perfect for reaction images. El Camino gave fans several new expressions to work with, especially because the older Jesse is more exhausted and emotionally broken than the younger version. But beneath the jokes, fans also connected deeply with Jesse's trauma. The internet discussion surrounding the film often focused on whether Jesse deserved his ending. Many viewers argued that after everything he had endured, he finally deserved a peaceful life. Others believe that his past actions meant he could never truly escape consequences. That debate is important because it shows how strongly the character had affected audiences. People were not simply asking whether the movie was entertaining. They were asking whether Jesse deserved happiness. That question has no simple answer. If we judge Jesse only by his crimes, the answer becomes complicated. If we judge him by the choices he made under extreme pressure, the answer becomes more sympathetic. If we judge him by the person he became over the course of the series, we see someone who repeatedly tried to resist becoming cruel. That is the power of the character. Jess never becomes completely innocent. He becomes human, and perhaps that is more meaningful. The movie also benefits from the fact that it does not spend too much time explaining the entire history of Breaking Bad. It assumes the audience remembers enough. That was a smart decision because the movie would have become exhausting if it stopped every few minutes to explain who Walter was or why Todd was dangerous. Instead, it trusts long-time viewers. If you remember the series, the smallest detail can have enormous meaning. If you do not remember everything, some scenes may be confusing, but the emotional story remains understandable. This is especially obvious in the flashbacks. A viewer who remembers Breaking Bad understands exactly why Jesse's interactions with Jane, Mike, and Walter are emotional. A new viewer might simply see people from Jesse's past. The movie is therefore designed primarily as a companion piece to the original series rather than a completely independent story. It rewards familiarity, the cinematography also rewards familiarity. Gilligan and his team use visual echoes from the television series throughout the movie. The desert, the industrial locations, the vehicles, and the unusual camera angles all remind viewers of the original show. But the film format allows the production to make these images larger. The landscape becomes more cinematic, the camera can stay on Jesse longer, the filmmakers can spend more time on a single sequence. Gilligan had previously directed television under strict schedules, but El Camino gave him the opportunity to approach the story as a feature film. That difference is visible in the pacing. Television episodes often have to establish a plot, build tension, and reach a conclusion within a specific time. A feature film can spend more time creating atmosphere. El Camino takes advantage of that freedom. There are scenes that might have been shorter in an episode but are allowed to breathe here. Jesse's movements through the city, his searches for money, and his encounters with old locations all receive time to develop. Some viewers found that slow pace frustrating, and that criticism is understandable. The movie does not constantly escalate. There are stretches where Jesse is simply trying to figure out what to do next, but that is also the point. His life has become a series of small decisions. He does not have a master plan, he is improvising. If the movie moved at the speed of a typical action thriller, Jesse's emotional condition would feel less believable. The production's decision to shoot around New Mexico also helped preserve the identity of the universe. Albuquerque is almost another character in Breaking Bad. The city is not just a background. Its streets, desert, neighborhoods, and businesses are deeply connected to the story. Returning to those locations after 6 years creates a strange feeling of familiarity. Fans recognize places before the movie even explains why they matter. The production team also recreated and revisited several recognizable environments to make the movie feel connected to the series. One of the fascinating behind the scenes stories is the effort to recreate locations and props without revealing the production. The filmmakers were working with one of the most recognizable television franchises in the world, yet they needed to maintain secrecy. A single photograph could have spoiled the movie, so production had to be careful with vehicles, signs, sets, and actor appearances. The fake production title Greenbrier helped hide what was really being filmed. Wikipedia.org, the secrecy also created an unusual atmosphere around the production. People who saw filming happening in Albuquerque could speculate, but there was no official confirmation. Fans knew that Aaron Paul had been spotted around the area, but there was no clear explanation. Rumors grew. Some people suspected a Breaking Bad movie, while others thought the actors might be involved in another project. When Netflix finally revealed the film, the surprise became part of its identity. The announcement was particularly effective because the movie did not need years of traditional marketing. Breaking Bad had already built the audience. Netflix simply needed to tell fans that Jesse's story was coming back. The trailer itself became an event. Fans immediately started analyzing every frame, trying to identify locations, characters, and clues. The marketing worked because it gave viewers a question instead of an answer. What happened to Jesse? That question had been sitting in the minds of fans for 6 years. The trailer did not need to explain everything, it simply needed to confirm that the story was continuing, and that was enough. The release also happened at an interesting moment in streaming history. Netflix was increasingly using major original films as streaming events rather than relying entirely on traditional theatrical releases. El Camino was a perfect example because its audience already existed on the platform. The company could release the film directly to millions of subscribers while also giving it a limited theatrical run for people who wanted to experience it on a big screen. This approach also changed the meaning of box office success. If someone watched El Camino at home, there was no traditional ticket sale. Yet that person still counted as part of the movie's audience. Netflix reported more than 25 million households watching during its first week, making it one of the service's major early film events. Thurap.com. The numbers demonstrated that an audience did not necessarily need a huge theatrical campaign to turn a streaming film into a major cultural event. The critical response was also significant because critics were comparing the movie not simply with other Netflix films but with one of television's most respected dramas. That created an unusually high standard. A 92% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes is impressive under normal circumstances, but it becomes even more impressive when the project is essentially attempting to add another chapter to a story that had already received an acclaimed ending. RottenTomatoes.com Metacritic score was more moderate but still positive, reflecting the same general idea. The movie worked, Aaron Paul was excellent, the production looked impressive, and the story was satisfying. But some critics questioned whether it was truly necessary. Metacritic.com that criticism is probably the most reasonable criticism of the movie, not that it is bad, not that it is boring, not that it misunderstands Jesse, but that the original finale already gave Jesse a powerful ending. There is something beautiful about not knowing what happens to a character after the story ends. When Jesse drove away at the end of Breaking Bad, viewers could imagine anything. Maybe he lived quietly, maybe he was caught, maybe he became a carpenter, maybe he went to Alaska, maybe he spent the rest of his life running. The mystery belonged to the audience. El Camino takes away some of that mystery. But it replaces mystery with closure. Whether that is an improvement depends entirely on the viewer. For some people, the unknown ending was better. For others, 6 years of wondering what happened to Jesse made El Camino exactly the movie they wanted. There is also an interesting argument that the film actually makes the original finale stronger. Before El Camino, Jesse's escape could be seen as a sudden burst of freedom. After watching the movie, we understand how difficult that freedom really was. We realize that Jesse still had hours of danger, fear, and desperation ahead of him. The final scene of Breaking Bad becomes the beginning of a journey rather than the end of one. That changes the emotional meaning of Jesse's laughter. When he drives away screaming, he is not celebrating a perfect future, he is celebrating survival. He has survived the compound, he has survived Walt, he has survived Todd, he has survived years of violence, but he still has to figure out what comes next. That makes the original ending even more complicated. It also makes Jesse's relationship with Walter more tragic. Walter's final act toward Jesse is one of the few moments when he stops trying to control him. He gives Jesse the choice to kill him. Jesse refuses. He tells Walter that if Walter wants to die, he should do it himself. Then he drives away. That moment is crucial because Jesse refuses to let Walter determine his final action. For years, Walter had manipulated Jesse's choices. In the end, Jesse chooses not to become Walter. That decision carries into El Camino. Jesse is still dealing with the consequences of Walter's actions, but he is no longer following Walter's path. He is finally choosing another one. This is why the movie's final destination matters so much. Alaska is not just a location, it is the opposite of Albuquerque. Albuquerque is where Jesse's old life happened. Alaska represents distance, cold, emptiness, and anonymity. It is far enough away to make the old identity feel less immediate. Ed's ability to create a new identity means Jesse can finally become someone the world does not recognize. There is almost something poetic about a character who spent years being known by his nickname finally becoming unknown. Jesse Pinkman was once a name connected to drugs, crime, and Walter White. At the end, he can become nobody, and nobody can be freedom. That idea also connects to the final conversation with Ed. Ed is not giving Jesse a magical new life, he is giving him an opportunity. Jesse still has to live with himself. A new name cannot erase memories. A new location cannot erase trauma. But it can create space for healing. The movie wisely ends before we can see whether that healing is complete, because healing is not a destination, it is a process. And Jesse's process can continue without the audience watching. That is why another sequel would probably be unnecessary. The story has reached the point where Jesse's future is better left unseen. We know enough, he has escaped, he has a new identity, he has a chance to build a life, the rest belongs to him. And that is perhaps the most respectful ending Vince Gilligan could have given the character. There is another fascinating aspect of El Camino that is easy to miss. The movie is essentially about a person learning to trust his own instincts again. Jesse has spent years being manipulated by people who were stronger, smarter, or more powerful than him. Walter manipulated him intellectually. Gus intimidated him through power. Todd controlled him physically. The Nazi gang controlled him through imprisonment. Jesse was repeatedly put into situations where his own choices did not matter. In the movie, however, Jesse begins making decisions independently. He decides to search for the money. He decides whom to trust, he decides when to take risks, he decides when to fight, he decides whether to accept Ed's deal, and finally he decides to leave. These decisions are not always perfect. Jesse makes mistakes. He becomes desperate. He takes dangerous chances, but they are his mistakes. That is an important part of freedom. A controlled life can be safe in some ways, but it is not truly yours. Jess finally gets a life that belongs to him. The film therefore ends on a surprisingly hopeful note despite everything that happened. There is no guarantee of happiness, but there is possibility. The camera does not need to show us Jesse becoming successful, it only needs to show him moving forward. That is why the road is such a powerful image. The road does not promise anything. It simply continues. Jess does not know exactly where his new life will lead. But for the first time, neither does anyone else, and that uncertainty is freedom. One of the biggest reasons El Camino has remained interesting to fans is that it does not simply answer what happened to Jesse. It changes the way we understand his final moments in Breaking Bad. When the original series ended, Jesse's escape was almost impossible to process because so much had happened in such a short time. Walter had returned to Albuquerque, the Nazi compound had been attacked, Jesse had been rescued, and Walter had been fatally wounded. Jesse jumped into the El Camino and drove away laughing and crying at the same time. It was an incredibly emotional image, but we never knew what happened after the car disappeared into the darkness. El Camino takes that single moment and expands it into an entire story about survival. Suddenly, the laughter at the end of Breaking Bad feels different. Jesse was not laughing because his problems were over. He was laughing because he was alive, because he had escaped, and because for the first time in years nobody was physically controlling him. The movie also makes Jesse's physical condition much more important than the original finale had time to show. He has been imprisoned for months, forced to cook meth, beaten, threatened, and treated as property. His body is covered with the evidence of that abuse. When he arrives at Skinny Pete's place, there is no glamorous version of the escaped criminal. He looks exhausted and terrified. This is important because many crime movies treat escape as the final victory. Once the hero gets out, the audience is expected to celebrate. El Camino asks what happens when the person who escaped is too damaged to celebrate normally. Jesse needs a shower, food, sleep, clean clothes, and a safe place. These basic needs become part of the story because Gilligan wants us to understand that Jesse's freedom begins with rebuilding the smallest pieces of normal life. That approach gives the movie a realism that some viewers may not immediately notice. Jesse is not suddenly an expert fugitive. He does not have a perfect plan. He is improvising. He is trying to remember what he knows about people and places. He is making decisions while exhausted and frightened. That makes his victories more satisfying because they are not the victories of a superhero. They are the victories of somebody who has almost nothing left but still refuses to give up. The character's desperation also explains why money becomes such a major part of the plot. In the Breaking Bad universe, money has always been connected to freedom and control, but Jesse's relationship with it is completely different from Walter's. Walter wanted millions because he wanted to prove his value and secure his family's future. Jesse needs a relatively small amount because he wants to disappear. He is not dreaming about mansions or sports cars. He wants an identity, a place to live, and enough money to survive. That makes his search for cash surprisingly emotional. Every dollar is connected to the possibility of becoming free. This is why the scenes involving Todd's hidden money are so important. Todd is dead, but his life still contains the resources Jesse needs. Jesse is forced to return to its world to find what he needs to leave that world. It is almost like the universe is demanding one final prize from him. He cannot simply walk away. He has to go back, confront his memories, and take something from the past that will allow him to escape it. The Todd apartment sequence also reveals something fascinating about Todd himself. His possessions show that he desperately wanted to appear ordinary. He had decorations, hobbies, and personal interests. He could make dinner, listen to music, and talk about everyday things. But the audience knows what exists beneath that surface. Todd is a perfect example of how Breaking Bad often hides horror inside normal environments. A house can look safe while containing something terrible. A polite conversation can hide a threat. A friendly smile can belong to someone capable of extraordinary cruelty. That is one of the reasons Todd became such a popular character for analysis. He is not a traditional villain with a dramatic philosophy. He does not spend hours explaining why he is evil. In some ways, that makes him scarier. He simply accepts the world around him as it is. When violence becomes necessary, he does it. When someone dies, he continues his day. When Jesse is imprisoned, Todd can still talk to him as if they have a normal relationship. That emotional disconnect makes him deeply unsettling. Jess Plemons' performance is therefore more subtle than it might appear. Todd rarely needs to raise his voice. Plemons often plays him with an almost childlike politeness. He smiles, he asks questions, he tries to be helpful. But the audience has learned to distrust every friendly gesture. That makes even ordinary scenes tense. When Todd offers Jesse food, we are thinking about everything else Todd has done. When Todd talks about his interests, we are wondering how a person like this can behave so normally. This contrast also creates some of the movie's darkest comedy. Todd's obsession with appearing normal becomes almost ridiculous. The audience can laugh at the absurdity of his behavior while still feeling uncomfortable. That balance between comedy and horror is one of Vince Gilligan's strongest storytelling skills. The original Breaking Bad often made audiences laugh at situations that were objectively horrifying. El Camino carries that tradition forward. The movie's humor is particularly important because Jesse himself has always been one of the main sources of comedy in the Breaking Bad universe. Early Jesse was loud, immature, and often unintentionally funny. His slang became part of the show's identity. His arguments with Walter became legendary. Even in the darkest episodes, Jesse could sometimes break the tension with a ridiculous comment. But in El Camino, most of that humor is gone. The few moments where Jesse gets to laugh therefore become more meaningful. They remind us that the old Jesse is still somewhere inside him. This is another reason the movie's ending feels earned. Jesse does not become the loud, reckless young man he was at the beginning of Breaking Bad. He becomes quieter, he becomes more careful. But he is not completely destroyed. There is still enough of Jesse left for him to build something new. The movie is therefore not about restoring the old Jesse. It is about creating a new Jesse from whatever remains. The flashbacks with Jane help communicate that idea. Jane represents one of the last periods when Jesse believed that he could escape the world around him with someone he loved. Her death destroyed him emotionally. He blamed himself in many ways, and Walter's involvement made the loss even more complicated. In El Camino, Jane does not return as a living character. She exists as a memory, which is exactly how she should exist. Jesse is not trying to bring the past back, he is learning from it. Her conversation with him about following the current of life is especially important because Jesse has spent so much time fighting against circumstances he could not control. He tried to control his addiction. He tried to control his relationship with Walter. He tried to leave the drug world. He tried to protect people. Sometimes he succeeded, but often he failed because the people around him had more power. By the end, Jesse has to accept that he cannot rewrite the past. He can only decide what direction he takes now. Mike's memory provides a different kind of guidance. Mike was one of the few characters who understood the criminal world without romanticizing it. He knew that people like Walter and Gus were playing dangerous games. He knew Jesse had a conscience. His advice about Alaska becomes a small but powerful piece of Jesse's future. It is almost as if Mike gives Jesse a map without realizing how important it will become. That is one way of the emotional tricks of El Camino. Characters who are already dead still shape Jesse's decisions. Walter, Mike, and Jane are physically gone, but their words remain with him. Jesse's new life is therefore built partly from the lessons of his old one. Some lessons are painful, some are useful, some are warnings, but all of them become part of his understanding of what he wants. The final destination of Alaska also works because it feels almost impossibly far away from Albuquerque. The original series made Albuquerque feel like a complete universe. The characters had businesses, homes, drug labs, neighborhoods, and relationships that connected everything together. Jesse cannot simply change his phone number and stay in the same city. He needs distance. Alaska gives him that distance. It is a place where he can be unknown. And being unknown is something Jesse has almost never experienced. For most of his adult life, somebody knew who he was. The police knew him, the dealers knew him, Walter knew him, Gus knew him, Todd knew him, the Nazis knew him. Even when Jesse wanted to disappear, somebody always seemed to find him. At the end, he finally has the chance to become a person nobody recognizes. That makes the final identity almost more important than the location itself. Ed is not simply moving Jesse to another city, he is helping him become someone else. The old Jesse Pinkman can finally disappear. The new person can begin without the world constantly reminding him who he used to be. Of course, the movie does not pretend that a new name erases trauma. That would be unrealistic. Jesse will remember what happened. He will remember Jane, he will remember Andrea, he will remember Mike, he will remember Walter, he will remember Todd. He will probably carry those memories for the rest of his life. But the movie suggests that memory does not have to equal imprisonment. That is a surprisingly hopeful message. You cannot change what happened, but you can change what happens next. This idea also explains why Jesse's carpentry dream matters so much. Throughout the series, he shows an interest in working with his hands and creating things. The contrast between carpentry and meth production is deliberate. Meth is about destruction, addiction, and profit. Carpentry is about building, it takes patience, it produces something physical, it requires skill without destroying other people's lives. Jesse's desire to become a carpenter therefore represents a completely different version of himself. He is not trying to build an empire. He wants to build furniture. That may sound small, but for Jesse, small is beautiful. Walter would probably have seen such a life as a failure. Jesse sees it as freedom. That difference is the entire story. The film's emotional power comes from understanding that Jesse does not need to become extraordinary anymore. He has spent years surrounded by people obsessed with being extraordinary. Walter wanted to be remembered as a genius. Gus wanted to control an empire. Mike wanted to survive in a dangerous world. Todd wanted to please powerful people. Jesse simply wants to live, and after everything he has experienced, that is enough. The movie also has an interesting relationship with the idea of masculinity. Breaking Bad often showed men measuring themselves through power, money, violence, and control. Walter becomes increasingly obsessed with proving that he is the smartest man in the room. Jesse, however, becomes more emotionally aware as the series continues. He cries. He feels guilt, he cares about children, he wants to protect people. He struggles with killing. In a world where emotional weakness is often treated as a problem, Jesse's ability to care is actually one of his strongest qualities. That is why the audience continues to root for him even after his mistakes. We recognize his humanity. Aaron Paul understood that from the beginning. His performance never treats Jesse like a completely innocent victim. Instead, he plays him as someone who has made mistakes and knows it. That guilt is visible. Jesse does not need to explain every mistake because his face often tells us he remembers them. This is also why the movie does not need a traditional villain. Todd exists in the flashbacks, but the present day Jesse's biggest enemy is the world he is trying to leave. The police are searching for him, his own memories haunt him, money is running out, trust is difficult, the criminal world is dangerous. There is no single mastermind behind everything. Jesse is simply trying to survive the consequences of a life that has collapsed. That makes El Camino feel almost like a survival film. There is also a subtle irony in the fact that Jesse has spent so much of the series running away from danger, yet the final stage of his escape requires him to willingly walk back into danger. He returns to places connected with Todd. He meets dangerous people, he takes risks, he confronts men who could kill him. The difference is that now he is doing it for himself. The risks are no longer being imposed on him by Walter or Gus. That is what makes his final confrontation so satisfying. Jesse finally gets a choice, and he chooses survival. The action is not particularly heroic in the traditional sense. Jesse does not walk away looking invincible. He is not transformed into an action star. The scene is messy, frightening, and desperate. But that is exactly how it should be. Jesse is not suddenly a different person. He is simply using everything he has learned to protect his future. The filmmaking also makes the final confrontation feel different from many of the shootouts in Breaking Bad. There is more emphasis on space and anticipation. The audience understands the environment. We know where people are standing. We can feel the tension building. The scene becomes almost like a Western duel with Jesse confronting the final obstacle between himself and freedom. And when the violence is over, the movie does not celebrate it, just does not become excited about killing. He simply continues. That is important. Violence is a tool he uses to escape, not an identity he embraces. Walter's journey went in the opposite direction. Violence gradually became part of who he was. Jesse's journey is about using violence only when necessary and then leaving it behind. That is why the final shot feels so different from the beginning of the movie. At the beginning, Jesse is surrounded by the consequences of violence. At the end, he is surrounded by open space. The visual language changes from confinement to possibility. The production design helps this transition as well. The movie moves between cramped interiors and wide landscapes. Todd's apartment is enclosed and uncomfortable. Jesse's hiding places feel temporary. The welding shop is industrial and threatening. The desert is enormous. The final road feels open. The physical environments reflect Jesse's emotional journey from imprisonment toward freedom. This is a technique Gilligan used throughout Breaking Bad, where locations often reflected character psychology. The difference in El Camino is that almost everything is connected directly to Jesse. We are not jumping between Walt's house, Gus's restaurant, Saul's office, and Jesse's apartment as separate storylines. We are following one person through a series of spaces that represent different parts of his past. That focus makes the movie feel intimate. It also explains why some viewers who wanted a larger Breaking Bad story were disappointed. If you were expecting Gus Fring, Saul Goodman, and another giant drug war, El Camino was never going to satisfy that expectation. Gilligan deliberately avoided turning the movie into a new season of Breaking Bad. The story belongs to Jesse, and in retrospect, that was probably the correct decision. Because there was another Breaking Bad universe story happening around the same time in a different form, Better Call Saul. That series was expanding the world through Jimmy McGill, Mike, Gus, and other characters. El Camino did not need to compete with that. It had a different job. It needed to close Jesse's chapter. The film's connection to Better Call Saul is therefore interesting as part of the larger universe. Both projects show how Vince Gilligan and his collaborators approached the same fictional world from completely different angles. Breaking Bad was about Walter's transformation. Better Call Saul explored Jimmy's transformation. El Camino explored Jesse's escape, three stories, three different kinds of tragedy, and three different approaches to character. Jesse's story may actually be the most hopeful of the three. Walter ends dead. Jimmy ends up facing the consequences of his past. Jess gets another chance. That does not make his story happy, but it makes it hopeful. The movie's release also allowed fans to experience a strange kind of nostalgia. Breaking Bad had ended in 2013, and by 2019, many viewers had moved on to other shows. The return of Jesse, Walter, Mike, and the familiar Albuquerque world created the feeling of opening an old photo album. Every familiar face carried memories of a different era of television. The fact that the movie was released after years of waiting made the experience even more emotional. It also helped that the filmmakers did not over explain the passage of time. They did not say, 6 years have passed since the finale. They simply drop the audience back into Jesse's world. For Jesse, almost no time has passed. For us, years have passed. That difference creates an emotional gap that the movie quietly uses. The movie's release on Netflix also changed how people discussed it. Unlike a traditional theatrical film, millions of viewers could watch it almost immediately. People could finish the movie and instantly go online to discuss the ending. Memes appeared within hours. Fans debated whether Jesse's ending was satisfying. People compared the movie with the original finale. Others searched for hidden references and production details. That online conversation became part of the movie's legacy. Some fans loved the fact that Jesse received closure. Others joked about the actors looking older. Some criticized the pacing. Some praised the cinematography. Some argued that the movie should have been shorter. Others wanted even more Jesse. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. Aaron Paul remained Jesse Pinkman. That is probably the most important achievement of the movie. After 6 years, the character still felt recognizable. The voice was there, the nervousness was there, the vulnerability was there, the anger was there, but there was also something new. Experience, pain, maturity. Jess had changed, and that is what a sequel should ideally accomplish. It should not simply repeat the character. It should show what happened to the character because of the first story. El Camino does exactly that. The movie also gives us a final look at what Walter White's actions really cost Jesse. During Breaking Bad, Walter's decisions often had immediate consequences, but the series had to move forward. El Camino has time to sit with the damage. Jesse is alive, but he is not untouched. His trauma becomes the central subject. This makes the film feel almost like an emotional epilogue to Walter's story. Walter's death ended his story, Jesse's survival begins another, and that is why the title is so fitting. The road does not end when Jesse escapes, the road begins. The movie ends because the audience no longer needs to watch every step. Jess has finally earned the right to continue without us. That might sound strange for a movie review, but it is actually the strongest argument for the ending. A bad ending tells you everything. A good ending tells you enough and lets your imagination do the rest. We do not need to see Jesse's first day in Alaska. We do not need to see his new apartment. We do not need to see him applying for a job. We do not need to see him buying woodworking equipment. We do not need to see him meeting a new girlfriend. We do not need to see him becoming successful. We only need to know that the possibility exists. And for Jesse Pinkman, possibility is everything. The final image therefore carries more emotional weight than a traditional happy ending could have. Jesse is driving toward an unknown future, but he is driving there by choice. The past is still behind him. The road ahead is uncertain. But for the first time, uncertainty is not something being forced upon him, it is his. And perhaps that is the perfect ending for one of television's most complicated characters.